I am Lama Yeshe. I came to Tibetan Buddhism, or Buddhism actually, in 1987 when I was 42 years old. And I'm speaking now in the shrine room of a center that I started that's affiliated with Karmatriyana Dharma Chakra Monastery, which is located just outside of Woodstock, New York. And it's Galwan Karmapa's monastery in the United States. So I thought, first of all, I would just show you a little bit about the site here. This is looking south, and you can see there's my house and my car. And you can see the puja tables. Here is the shrine. I'm doing this a lazy way. I'm sitting down in my chair, but there is the shrine that I'm sitting right next to. And then here on the other side, these are the west windows looking out, and you can see there are trees. It's a little bit early for leaves to be showing. It wasn't too many days ago, and there was snow on the ground. And then going to the west are more windows looking out on more trees, and then puja tables down there. And I'm going to show a few pictures too. I'm going to be talking about a foundation of Buddhist practice. And I decided a lot of people don't understand a foundation from a builder's point of view. So you're going to get a little bit of a teaching on that. Here is the south side of the building. So these windows that you saw the house and the car out of, that's what we're looking at. Here is the north and the west side of the building. It's built on a hill. I built this with the help of some friends back in 1977. This is putting up the roof. There you've got a little bit of history now. The basic teachings of the Buddha are about, first of all, Buddha nature, our inherent perfection of our mind, our essence. Chogyam Trungpa talked about primordial wisdom, basic goodness, and terms like that. These are referring to Buddha nature, the nature of our mind, who we are. So this is an important part of the teachings to always keep in mind, because it's easy to not really see that and think that we are a long ways from that, and maybe somehow or another we didn't get our share. The next is, of course, loving kindness. And the loving kindness of an enlightened being, I have had it explained this way, that the love that an ordinary being can experience, the closest to enlightened love, is that of a loving mother for her young child, where the child is more important than you. You give up getting regular sleep. You're up at all hours of the night and day. Perhaps in the best example, joyfully, all the difficulties of taking care of an infant. So that's this unconditional caring for another that is this loving kindness in its ideal form. A mother guides and protects the child, but on the other hand, a loving mother will allow the child room to grow and develop. And this loving kindness, you might say it works both ways. It works inward towards ourselves and outwards towards others, and we want to develop it both directions. And then the third is bodhicitta, which means awakened mind. In its relative form, it could be considered similar to compassion. Relative bodhicitta has two elements. It is the aspiration, bodhicitta, which is the aspiration to develop compassion and loving kindness for all beings and free all sentient beings from the suffering of samsara. Engagement bodhicitta is actually working to save all beings and working on ourselves so that we can develop the qualities necessary to free all beings from samsara. I'll talk about absolute bodhicitta in a later talk, so I'm not going to say too much about it right now. The important thing is when listening to a teaching, first of all, to keep these three things in mind: loving kindness, bodhicitta, Buddha nature, but have the motivation to, through listening to these teachings, that you can actually be of more benefit to other beings and more benefit to yourself. Personally, I think that it is wonderful if you can just drop everything and spend all of your time benefiting other beings. For most of us, we have to take care of ourselves enough so that we don't get completely worn out and drop from exhaustion and say, enough is enough, I'm giving up on this. In other words, if we don't really love ourselves, we can't really love other people. We don't know how to love other people. We don't know how to take care of ourselves. We don't know how to take care of other people. This is really what a lot of this series of teachings is going to be about. It's how to join our Buddhist aspirations and the Buddhist path with our mundane lives, our ordinary lives. On the Buddhist path, we want to attain enlightenment. And in our ordinary lives, we want to be happy. They're not a contradiction. We can learn to navigate life and incorporate both of these at the same time. So we want to listen to the teachings with a proper motivation, and along with the motivation is having the desire to learn something that will help you, something that will be of benefit to yourself and others. And compassion is wanting to free others from their suffering. Compassion turned inwards is renunciation, which means renouncing the causes of suffering. You've understood what the causes of suffering are, and you start looking inside and seeing the reason why you're suffering is because you are engaging in various actions of body, speech, and mind, which cause suffering. And when you see them, then let go of them the best that you can. As I said, we have two goals in Buddhism: traveling the path to enlightenment till fruition, and then having happiness in our daily lives. Our Dharma practice propels us on the path, and it helps us experience more contentment and happiness at the same time. We can apply the teachings in our daily life, and as a result, experience less stress, have more clarity in distinguishing what is important and what is minor. We can lead a more meaningful life and accumulate wisdom in our daily activities. But in order to do that, we need to get to know ourselves very, very well. We need to look inward. We need to know where we are on the path. We need to know our qualities and our faults the best that we can. I like to use the example of GPS. So you enter where you want to go, but you also have to enter where you are before you get directions that are reliable. So if we don't know where we are, then how can you have reliable directions to get to where you want to go? So self-knowledge is really important. We really need to make friends with ourselves. It's not self-knowledge of, oh, there I go again, I screwed up again, I'm always screwing up, da, 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 da. It's not that kind of self-knowledge. It's more seeing our faults, our weaknesses, seeing where we fall down, and then being gentle with ourselves and encouraging ourselves to change. Since our essence is Buddha nature, we're really guiding ourselves in the direction that we want to go when we do that. I kind of look at meditation as a bit like a wheel alignment. When you take your car in and your tires get out of alignment, then they wear unevenly, and you go into a mechanic and he lines your tires, and then now they're good to go. Meditation kind of gives our mind an alignment. We learn how to let go of thoughts and strong emotions and be aware of them and not be afraid of them, to sit with them. So Shantideva distinguishes the two bodhicittas this way. He uses the example of a map, studying a map. Studying a map is aspiration bodhicitta, is setting out on the path and traveling. That is engagement bodhicitta. We need both of those, and it's important to go back and contemplate this from time to time. And along with that, we need to contemplate what are called the four ordinary foundations. And these four ordinary foundations are contemplations, examinations that help us let go a little bit of our attachment to the various pleasures of samsara, perhaps even the drama of samsara, and help keep us focused when we are practicing and traveling the path. And it's good to think about these from time to time. You want to avoid the coming to the conclusion, oh, I've got it now. I understand it now. I like to compare that with putting your life on cruise control. You're not navigating anymore. You're on habitual patterns. So now comes my little talk about foundations. So what is a foundation? In building, a foundation is what you put on the ground to put the building on, and it has to be solid. A good example is you've got snow out in Boulder. Well, you can go snowshoeing in deep snow with snowshoes. The snowshoes keep you from sinking into the snow. A foundation keeps the building from sinking into the ground. I've got deer here, and deer have very small hooves, and they leave footprints in the dirt. When I walk in the same place, I've got big feet, and I don't leave footprints in the dirt unless it's muddy. So a foundation is like that. It is wider than the wall of the structure. And if you did not have a wide foundation out of the structure would sink into the ground. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is a good example of this. And so this is why we want a good foundation in our practice. We don't want our practice to fall over, develop cracks, and so forth. These four foundations have been used by our forefathers, the great Kagyu forefathers, for inspiration, enthusiasm. They have practiced day and night. And by us understanding this, we too can develop more diligence and enthusiasm for practice. And when we become discouraged, when you start having 1,001 excuses for not practicing, for being distracted, and so on and so forth, it's time to again go back and start contemplating these four thoughts. So I'm going to go into them briefly here. The first is precious human birth. And if we look at our human birth, it's so rare and precious to be a human as opposed to an animal, an insect. And if you really get into Tibetan Buddhism, there are other realms that are not visible to us. But in the human realm, we can come in contact with Buddhism, receive teachings, practice, and travel the path. We have various freedoms and leisures that allow us to accomplish the ultimate goal of Buddhahood. And this is the ultimate benefit to ourselves and the ultimate benefit to others. So we are in an extremely fortunate position. Very few people are as fortunate as we are if you have come in contact with Buddhism. There is a long list of other things that make our life precious. One, we're in a country that we can come in contact with Buddhism, we can practice freely. Our bodies are relatively good. We're not on a ventilator in an ER room or whatever, and our minds work fairly well. The standard explanation is having this fortunate rebirth is a result of discipline from past lives that you have led. It's not an accident. You didn't win the lottery and be reborn a human this time around. And what this means, this discipline means that you have avoided very negative acts and harmful behavior in your past life. You've cultivated virtuous thoughts and actions. You've had some altruistic motivation. And you've also had an aspiration to be born human. Here is an interesting part of Tibetan Buddhism. And I've talked to some Rinpoches about this, and they say that Buddha never specifically mentioned this. But Tai Situ, when he was giving a teaching, he said that an animal that's destined for the human realm, their last animal birth will be that of a dog. And if you think about it, dogs can be disciplined. They can learn to avoid negative actions and harmful behavior. They certainly have feelings. If you've ever had a dog, you know that. And they can become very attached to humans and very beneficial. I had a dog. I'm going to tell a dog story. This is an old farm here, and I had a building that used to be a chicken coop, and I used to store things in it, and it had a low ceiling. And I went in there one day, and there was a sparrow flying around, and I couldn't shoo him out the door, so I thought I'd bring my dog in, who was half black lab, about 60 pounds. You know, he was no little puppy. I've never trained him to hunt. I've trained him to behave himself, and he would very easy to discipline. So I called him in there. He saw the sparrow flying around and immediately jumped into the air, grabbed the sparrow in his mouth in flight, jumped up like a cat, comes down, and there's not even a feather sticking out of his mouth. And I'm thinking, well, that wasn't the plan. I was trying to save his life. So I called him out, and he lay down, and I shut the door, and 3 minutes later, he opened his mouth and the bird flew away. So he did help the bird out. It just wasn't exactly the way I had expected it. The next is impermanence and death. Here is a quote from Gyalwang Karmapa. Impermanence means that things are changing moment to moment. It indicates that with each moment, we have a new opportunity. And that's a very positive way to look at impermanence. And actually, Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche has a book out about the bardo, and he describes it as the interval of possibility. The point being that if we think about impermanence, we realize that we have a limited time to use our present body, and we don't know when that time is going to come to an end. And it doesn't have to end in death. It could end in a stroke and becoming paralyzed and having your mind, shall we say, scrambled. So it's good to think about these things, not in a negative way, but to keep us focused, to keep us on track, to keep our eyes on the goal. This helps us work with laziness. It helps us work with attachment. There are 5 Kadampa slogans that go into this contemplation in more depth. So I'll go through them very quickly. The first one is, think nothing lasts. Things are constantly changing. Do any of you have insurance? Well, I think insurance means that you believe that things might not last, that they could break, they could be destroyed, they could be stolen. Lots of things could happen to them. Unfortunately, life insurance doesn't give you a new life, on the other hand. I've owned my present house for 52 years, and I came up with a slogan about it, and it is called, because of impermanence, maintenance is permanent. I have 52 years doing maintenance on this house, and it's only when I give up on the house is maintenance no longer necessary. The next is, think of how many people that have died that you knew. And I can think of a pretty long list of people if I put my mind to it. A friend just died the 9th of April. I've had a number of friends that have died relatively young and healthy. Accidents will do that. You can be in the peak of your health, but if there's an accident, it really does not help one bit. I even had one friend that died at his computer making out his will. It's dangerous to make out your will. Anyway, contemplate how many friends and family you have lost, not to get depressed, but to realize that your time is limited and it's too precious to squander. I think that is a good phrase. It's too precious to squander. The third slogan is, think repeatedly of the many circumstances that might cause your death. And this keeps us from being in denial. I saw a bumper sticker one time that said, "Denial is not a river in Egypt." And we don't want to be in denial. Again, just think of how almost anything, anytime you could die. I'm going to sound a little bit maybe macabre here, but I have a friend whose brother was shot in a Home Depot store. There was a gunfight outside, and a stray bullet went through the store and hit him in the heart, and he died right there. Again, there's just all kinds of accidents that can happen out there. I'm going to stop at that. The next slogan is meditate on what will happen at the time of death. What will be your reaction when you realize that you're leaving everything behind? All your physical belongings, your loved ones, your expectations, you'll leave everything behind. And quite honestly, this is what drew me to Buddhism, is when my best friend was killed in an accident on a street in a nearby city of about 12,000 people. It was a small city. He was run over. He was on the street by a crosswalk with a light in his favor, and he was run over and killed. And it got me to be thinking about maybe I could be next. His property, his wife, his family, none of it helped him. So the last thing is think about what happens after death. In Buddhism, of course, that's the bardo and rebirth. So understand that you don't have a secure place, will never have a secure place, and that right now is the time to practice. The third ordinary foundation is thinking about karma as cause and effect. Very simply, when we engage in virtuous behavior, we are planting the seeds of happiness in the future and good circumstances. And when we engage in negative actions of body, speech, and mind, we're planting the seeds of future suffering. Here is another quote of Gyalwang Karmapa. As we are all interdependent, everything I do not only affects myself, my family, or people close to me, but has an effect on the whole world. It is very important, therefore, that we take responsibility for our actions. So we want to, again, look inward, examine ourselves, see where we need to do work, and try to reduce these negative patterns, purify the karma that we have accumulated, and keep focusing on planting positive seeds. The last of these four foundations is titled The Defects of Samsara. People that I teach mostly are concerned about the present life. They're not too concerned when I have individual interviews or when they ask questions. Well, what about my next life? I mainly have contact with Western students, and I think that might be why. So I'm going to just talk about our present life. We like to think that if we just get our ducks in a row, that things will be better, that I can relax, I'll have enough money, I won't have to worry about all the things that I worry about now. The Buddha talked about all kinds of different sufferings that we experience in life. And one of them is, he divided it up in different ways. I'm going to talk about the three types of suffering: the suffering of suffering, the suffering of change, and all pervasive suffering. So the suffering of suffering is just purely visible suffering, physical pain. It's suffering when it arises, and it isn't necessarily physical pain. It could have been that yesterday was tax day and you didn't have enough money to pay your taxes. Or it could be in a month you'll get a letter from the IRS saying, we'd like to get to know you better. It could be problems with your children, problems with your partner. There's no end to problems. It's suffering when it arises, it's suffering as it persists, and then when it ceases, the suffering ends. And it's one suffering after another, it's endless. By the time one suffering ends, another one has already arisen. Maybe two more, three more have already arisen. Here's a teaching that I received. It was an accidental teaching. At KTD, way back in the late 80s, they had a pop machine. Some parts of the country, they call it a soda machine, by the dining room. And I saw a Rinpoche go up to that machine, put his money in, push the button, and the pop didn't come out. So things don't necessarily go your way, even if you're highly realized. So don't think you can get out of it that way. This is just the way samsara works. Now, the suffering is change. We have temporary happiness, but then it goes and it becomes suffering. We had a moment of happiness and then it's gone. Another way to put it is if you aren't happy before you get what you want, you won't be happy long after you get it. This is the way samsara works. They talk about buyer's remorse. The third is all pervasive suffering, and this is everywhere in samsara. We are under the influence of the three poisons: ignorance, hatred, attachment. We're not free of them. We try. We are not independent. We are under the power of these afflictive emotions. Then there is also fear, all kinds of different fears that are buried deeply that can bubble up to the surface. Something that I like to point out is people talk about doctors saving lives. They don't. They prolong life. If they save the life, then there would be no death. They prolong life. We can look at lots and lots of blind spots like this in our lives. We just cover up these uncomfortable places with. The bottom line is that there is no safe place in samsara. You can die at any time. You're powerless to prevent it. At best, you can prolong your life. And I go to doctors, no problem, but it also is realizing it could be the next time I see a doctor, he's going to say we need more tests. And the result of the tests is, well, I have to tell you something. You have this, and the survival rate is 6 months or whatever. So the obstacles that we have to practice can be addressed with these four thoughts. Attachments to the pleasures of life. The antidote is contemplating precious human birth and impermanence. Contemplate the freedoms and opportunities that we have in our human existence and how difficult it is to obtain it. How fleeting and how fragile our life really is. Not to the point of getting paranoid, but just realize that you have to, as I said, life is too precious to squander. You need to use it now rather than, say, some point in the future when you have more time and more money and resources and so forth. And carry this into your daily life. Contemplate them over and over. It isn't like you finish the third grade and you never have to go back to the third grade, because then you go to the fourth and fifth, and then you graduate from high school, and then maybe you go to college and graduate from that, and then you're done. It isn't like that. It's that you need to keep your eye and your mind focused. There's so much to indulge in that is really meaningless in the long run. So we have to keep focused. A sign that these contemplations are helping is that you have more equanimity, that you're more at ease with your life situations. Your priorities change, experience more contentment and satisfaction. And it might be incrementally, it probably will be incrementally, and it's going to go up and down too, but the general trend is up. Another antidote that this works for is wanting to have relative happiness in this life and future ones, but not focused on the ultimate goal. And the antidote is to focus on karma and realize that in trying to accomplish this happiness, you are planting the seeds of more suffering in the future. And the other is that suffering pervades all of samsara, that try as you may, no matter how much temporary happiness you have, it's going to change and there will be more suffering. If you think about it, if money was a source of happiness, why don't these extremely wealthy people retire and just enjoy their lives instead of wanting to make more money and more money and more money? So these four thoughts could be compared to a horse that pulls the cart. These give us the energy for progressing through the three vehicles in Tibetan Buddhism. I am going to finish up this particular section. There's more of the talk, but I've got it divided into two sections. This is on the 5 unrealistic expectations we have of samsara. And these are brief contemplations. The first is thinking I am the most important person in the room. And it's a pretty big room that I'm in, and I carry this room with me wherever I go. Needless to say, the other people in the room, they're probably thinking the same thing. The next is I should be respected. Just because of who I am, I deserve respect. On the other hand, others need to earn my respect. I just don't give it out freely to anyone, unconditionally. The third is others should live up to my expectations. And I have a lot of expectations, actually. Sometimes it even gets to the point of others should know my expectations without me even telling them. I once overheard this conversation between two co-workers. Quote, I told him I don't understand why you don't understand me. End quote. The fourth is I should not be harmed bodily or otherwise. You get into a traffic jam at rush hour, and of course, you've got the traffic jam, and then there's you. You have nothing to do with this traffic jam. Just because everybody else wanted to be on the road at that very time at this place, and you did too, you look at yourself as being separate from that, and you're being harmed by this traffic jam, and maybe you even get mad, or maybe someone else gets mad at you. Of course, you don't want to be hurt physically. You don't want to be scammed, and you certainly don't want to wait very long in the checkout line at the grocery store. That really can cause a big problem. In other words, we can have a very low threshold for difficulties. I won't go into that much more. Think about it. Then my favorite one is life should be fair, and I'm the Supreme Court. Case closed. These are things to contemplate. Now, I am going to talk a little bit about myself here again. I started out in 1987 as a student of Chogyam Trungpa with his Sangha and teachers that he had authorized. Chogyam Trungpa died a week after I first received meditation instruction, so I never had any chance to meet him. But I have read a lot of his books. In 88, I took refuge with Khenpo Karta Rinpoche, and then in 89, I became his student. In 1993, I entered a 3-year retreat that he was the retreat master, and completed that in 1996. I took monastic vows with Taisita Rinpoche in 1994 in retreat. And then when I returned home, I started a KTC, which means a satellite center affiliated with KTD. And Rinpoche gave me the title of Retreat Lama. So that's why I use the title Lama. After the retreat ended, I didn't have a clue of what I was going to do for work at first. I ended up doing construction work. And then after that, I got a job as a prison chaplain. Meanwhile, running the center here and occasionally traveling to different centers and KTD, giving teachings and so forth. The reason that I came to Tibetan Buddhism can be summed up in 2 words: depression and trauma. And the techniques in Tibetan Buddhism gave me the tools to work with them and use them in a positive way, use them for growth. A dictionary definition is, quote, a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, end quote. You can have repeated traumatic experiences, which increases the intensity and can lead to PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. This is what Wikipedia says about PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental and behavioral disorder that can develop because of exposure to a traumatic event such as sexual assault, warfare, traffic collisions, child abuse, domestic violence, or other threats to a person's life, end quote. I've also learned that there is generational trauma and it can be passed down from one generation to another. I did some research on my family and I found certainly incidences of that too. On my mother's side, it turns out my grandfather or my mother's father was an alcoholic. Turned out that my mother had been sexually assaulted as a little girl. I kind of suspected this when I went to work in the prison because I found men that had been sexually assaulted that were now prisoners behaved in a very similar way. I would describe my mother when I was growing up and really up until she developed dementia as tormented by fear, by anxiety, by worrying, and wanted to control everything because she was afraid of everything. On the other hand, when she developed dementia, gradually her memory was destroyed, erased, take your pick, and she became this happy grandmother, about like a 3-year-old, but very, very happy. And I was delighted to see that. And in fact, I had specifically requested that my parents move up closer to me from Colorado. They were in Colorado Springs, up here to the North Country, so that I could help them. They moved into a retirement complex. And mom changed so much that when she was younger, she would hire a Black woman to clean her house, but she didn't want to have anything to do with them socially. But now in this Alzheimer's unit, one of the head nurses was from Africa, and this is how much her behavior changed. She gave the normal greeting that she would give to any other staff member to this African nurse, which was, "Oh, honey, you're so sweet. Come over here and let me give you a hug." And the nurse would, and she would get a big hug. And sometimes mom would grab her hand and start kissing her hand. I was delighted to see that personality change, needless to say. I'm going to go over what my childhood was like because this is what led me to Buddhism. And I'm saying this because I know that lots of people have had not too different childhoods, but have not been able to really process it. I'm not asking for sympathy here. I'm showing a way through trauma. So mom was very strict with me. I was punished frequently. I had nightmares throughout childhood, even up until the time that I started to meditate. I stuttered as a child. At the age of 14, I was hospitalized because of a suicide attempt. As I got older and larger, this punishment became more severe. I don't remember when she started, but by this time I was getting whipped with a leather belt, and mom would be hysterical and be hitting me as hard as she could. And you never knew when she was going to blow up, what would be you might say, the trigger. And she would tell me things like, "This hurts me more than it does you." And now that I can look back on this, it probably did hurt her more than it did me because she was in extreme agony as she was whipping me. Another one that she said was, she had been to college, quote, "My psychology professor in college said, crazy people don't think they're crazy, and I think I'm crazy. So I must not be crazy." I think that's called denial too. When I was 16 years old, I was tired of coming into my bedroom. I certainly wouldn't go out of my bedroom because she'd be out there. I would not sit around in the family room with the family and watch television. That was the last thing I wanted to do. So I'd be in my room. So she would come to my room, and tell me whatever was on her mind and then leave and then come back later. And I just had enough, and I barricaded my door, which opened inward. There was no lock on it. Barricaded it with the bed and some other furniture, and she couldn't get in, and she went ballistic, and I ended up getting committed to an adult psychiatric ward, locked ward. And she did not do the legal commitment. So after, I don't know, 4 days, I was free to go. And when they told me I was free to go, I stayed an extra day because it was more sane than at home. Even though I would see men after a shock treatment sitting in a wheelchair going, completely exhausted. I still was unhappy. And so I stole the family car and a credit card and put about 1,500 miles on the car before the police stopped me. So that was my childhood. When I was in my sophomore year of college, I went home for Christmas and had a nightmare. And I dreamed that I was being held prisoner I was in my own bedroom, and I dreamed I was being held prisoner and I was going to be taken out and executed. And so I got up and went over to my bedroom window, knocked the glass out with my bare hands, and then jumped through it, kind of like the cowboy movies, head first, hit the ground, and ran like hell. That ended me up in the ER room. That was one of the last times I went home for 29 years because I just couldn't take it. They did pay for my college education, so on and so forth, but I left having tremendous anger towards my parents. And I carried this with me. And of course, the anger was inside. I stayed in touch with my folks because they were very attached to me. In fact, I hadn't planned on doing this, but I am going to get a picture that I found the other day that really demonstrates how attached. Doesn't it look like she's afraid I might get loose? I was about 35 at that age. So I got to see, they would always come up and visit me, and I saw them a lot, but it was always tense. It was always tense. I moved out here kind of to drop out of sight and become invisible. In 1969, I went with my wife and my 2-year-old son from Minneapolis to Chicago for a wedding. And maybe this is my karma. The wedding went very well, but I stayed with my college friend down in a rough part of Chicago on the edge of the South Side ghetto. And the next morning, I helped them take out trash. And this was a rough neighborhood. And the police arrested both of us for growing and harvesting marijuana. Yes, I've been in jail. They've opened up their trunk and they pulled up all the weeds that were growing around the trash cans. And I mean weeds, not weed. And said that they were in our possession, and ended up in the Cook County Jail, and came back a month later and had my day of court, which lasted about 45 seconds, which they read the lab report and said, case dismissed. By this time, I had a bad attitude towards authority. The government wanted to send me to Vietnam. I didn't like the police much before this. And I came out here to kind of disappear and did a back to the land for a few years. And then eventually in 1985, my whole world fell apart when my best friend was killed in town 25 minutes south of here and was killed instantly. And I just fell apart emotionally. I think that's a good way to put it. Everything that I'd been working hard for was basically meaningless. My wife couldn't help me at the time of death. I felt really vulnerable and I became very depressed. And the psychiatrist that I went to put me on a very powerful treatment-resistant drug, because the first drug he gave me, after using it a little while, I realized it completely got me spaced out and it was dangerous for me to operate equipment, and I like operating equipment. So then he put me on a very, very strong antidepressant medication, and I reacted in a very bizarre way, which was I became energized. I started reading books. I started getting interested in things in life, and eventually came in contact with meditation and a meditation instructor. And this is what I learned about depression. First of all, it takes a lot of thought. There's a reason why you're tired, because you have to spend a lot of energy thinking. There's a term, rumination. I started paying attention to what my thoughts were, and it was one negative thought after another, after another, after another. For the first time in my life, I kept a diary. And after 3 months, I went back and read it, and it was one page after another of the same old soap opera. And I started realizing what I'd like to listen to in terms of music was depressing messages. I liked depressing books about how bad things were. I liked movies about how bad things were, and so forth. And I went on a diet over the years of what I put into my head, whether it be media, music, reading. Started reading a lot of Buddhist books. I started realizing that I was creating my world with my thoughts, and the world that I created was an illusion. This is what the antidepressant did. It jerked me out of that depressed mode to the point where I could look at it and go, this stinks. This is not where I want to be. And I started working really hard to get to know it and get out of it and see it. And when I came to Tibetan Buddhism, I found out that's a very interesting thing. At least in my case, the depression had two elements to it. It was anger, primarily towards myself, but also towards the outward world too, but primarily towards myself. I had an inner critic that was constantly telling me how bad I was, how I keep screwing up, or I couldn't do this right, always making mistakes, and yada, yada, yada. The other is, besides anger, is laziness. In Tibetan Buddhism, they have three types of laziness. The first is couch potato. I don't know what the Tibetan word is, but I think we all know couch potato. You wake up in the morning and you think, oh, I've got all these things to do. I better close my eyes and get some more sleep so I have more energy. And maybe your mind just keeps ruminating over and over again about all the things that you got to do that are going to be impossible to do. And then you get up and maybe you eat breakfast, leave the dishes in the sink, and then lay on the couch. And so goes the day. I was able to sleep 16 hours a day sometimes. I excelled in couch potato. Now, before that, what I also came to realize is that I had probably been depressed since I was a kid, but didn't know it. And another type of laziness is excessive busyness. Keeping busy, very, very busy. You accomplish a lot, but you never seem to have enough time to get done what's important. I had accomplished a lot of stuff, but was it important? And I had realized that, well, first of all, at the time of death, it's all left behind. How important can it be? So I took a deep look at that kind of behavior. The third thing is self-deprecation. What this means is this form of laziness, it's low self-esteem. You sell yourself short. You think, oh, I can't do that, so why even try? Now, I'm not saying all depression is like this, but it's good to take a deep look inside when you are kind of feeling down and see if any of those elements are present. I also came into contact through Chogyam Trungpa. It's in his book, Meditation in Action. He has a chapter in there titled, The Manure of Our Experience for the Field of the Bodhi. And I had kept animals. I had a kind of a McDonald's farm here. I even had a manure spreader. I knew a little bit about manure, and that really struck me. And the point is, of course, when we see all of this, it's very fertile material. Instead of going, oh, there, I see it now. I keep doing things wrong. It's like, oh, I can work with this. This is workable. A friend of mine gave me, as a joke, a little, what now would have been called a computer printout. I don't know where he got it from. This was before the age of laptops. He didn't realize I was going through all of this introspection and Buddhism and so forth, but the sign said, the beatings will continue until morale improves. And then in small print, the management. And I got a big kick out of that, so much that I hung it up on my bulletin board in my kitchen. And I live alone. People would come over and they would scratch their head when they see that. Well, you live alone. And of course, the point was I had an inner manager that thought that the best way to improve was to beat myself up with this inner critic. And when I would go down that road, I would eventually see that sign and chuckle a little bit and lighten up. So this is another bit of advice, and that is lighten up, loosen up. Don't take things so seriously. Life is too short to take these little things so seriously. I have found that chuckling at myself and some of these silly ways of thinking is really helpful. Today, I put a post on my Facebook page, and it went something like this. I put a picture of a handful of dirt, and this is a true story. A man asked me, he was an acquaintance. He said, "You're older than dirt. Has dirt changed?" And I paused thoughtfully and said, "Yes, it's changed. It's faded." So laugh a little bit. Another thing that I did when I'm in a store, sometimes I like to talk. This is Wisconsin, first of all. It's right next to Minnesota, and they talk about Minnesota nice. And when I'm in a store waiting to check out, sometimes I will talk to the people next to me or in front of me or behind. And in this particular case, the store was called Farm and Fleet. I think that explains the whole thing. Fleet is your tractor, pickup, lawnmower, so on and so forth. He had a big bag of bird seed that he was paying for. And so I just said to him, "Your birds are going to be happy when you get home." He said, "Yeah, they get really upset when there's no feed in the feeder." And I've had a bird feeder and they do that. So the little 10-year-old in me came out and he said, "At my place, when there's no feed in the feeder, the birds all turn towards the house and they go, 'Cheep, cheep, cheep.'" And he buckled over laughing. So laugh a little bit. The question is, what do you do when you have PTSD from childhood and from death of parents and you're having dark moments? Now, the first thing is to realize that the depression is made out of parts and pieces, that it's not solid. It's not a solid brick wall or a concrete wall, because that'd be solid. A brick wall has pieces of brick, different individual bricks. And so you start seeing patterns, and you can work with individual patterns, and gradually the house of cards falls apart. Gradually, when you are having a dark time, I would advise looking at the thoughts that you are having and then letting them go the best that you can. If you've had some meditation practice, you've done a little bit of that. One easy way to let them go is to just start saying mantra. Om Mani Padme Hum. Om Mani Padme Hum. Om Mani Padme Hum. Om Mani Padme Hum. And then take a break. Again, paying attention to your thoughts. If you're in a bad mood, look at what thoughts you're having, because the mood is caused by thoughts in most cases. And so when you see the thoughts, let go of them the best you can or replace them with positive thoughts. I got a Chinese fortune cookie with this fortune in it when I was dining with Khenpo Karta Rinpoche at the Karmeling Retreat Center. And the fortune said, "To see your drama is to be liberated from it." So if you can see your drama as drama, no problem. So the question is, working with death, whether it be a recent death or something that happened years ago that still is very fresh and painful. So I am thinking about a poem that I wrote after a good friend of mine died. And this is what I wrote. The title is Questions After the Death of a Friend. Life is so precious, yet so easily lost. Friends are so precious, yet so easily lost. Health is so precious, yet so easily lost. Why squander such riches? Life is so uncertain, possibilities and probabilities, no guarantees of being alive tomorrow. What do we really control? Are you grieving for the loss others have suffered? Are you grieving for the loss you have suffered? Are you grieving because now you feel you could be next? When grieving, why not grieve clearly? The loss was in the past. If you are next, it's in the future. Why let happiness or unhappiness hinge on history or mystery? Savor the experience of living. Life is full of sorrows and joys. Allow yourself to experience both. Can you let them go? The question is, considering the impermanence of life and the preciousness of life, how is it best to use one's life? And this is going to be an individual decision. One, you could say you have two ends here. One end would be like Milarepa, and if you're really motivated, just go and practice. Now, most people aren't motivated that well, and they're going to crash and burn. The other is, of course, to forget about the spiritual and just pursue a worldly life. So what you're going to want is a balance where you're keeping your eye on wanting to travel the path and trying to spend a lot of time doing that, whereas you still need a place to live, you still need food. There are a lot of things you need in this country, but to distinguish between needs and wants and have this balance. I'll tell you, I'm an old man, and when I hear stories from young people, it's a different world that you're living in that I did when I was your age. But anyway, you have to figure this out. And whatever you do in your mundane life, you want to make sure that it's not involved in a lot of negative karma. Like you don't want to work at a slaughterhouse. You don't want to work at an ammunition factory, these sorts of things. Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche said this once to a woman who was in advertising. And I asked her once, who do you advertise for? She said, watch television. Those are my clients. She asked Rinpoche, she said, I'm feeling like I shouldn't be doing this. And he said, start your own company. And she did. And what she did was basically product research, how consumers use that particular cleaning product and so forth. And Rinpoche felt that was just fine. But she also practiced. She had a good, strong practice and was a good practitioner. The question is, to simplify it, about identity, and that it's easy to just gloss over differences and perhaps different experiences that a person has had in their lives. And how do you work with the differences without ignoring them, but without putting too much emphasis on them? What I have concluded, I have taught a number of different programs over the years on recovery from trauma. And it is, you can be a victim, you can be a survivor, and you can be an experiencer. A victim is holding on to the experience and it's just pushing them down. They've been screwed. It's totally bringing them down. They're defining themselves in a very negative way on the basis of one incident or a series of incidents. And it could be cancer. I mean, it doesn't have to be even something that somebody else did to you. The second choice is you could be a survivor, where you're feeling a little more positive. You made it, but you're still defining yourself on the basis of a very negative experience or group of experiences. That's who you are. I'm a survivor. If you are an experiencer, it means this is an experience that you've had, and maybe a group of experiences that you've had, but you've also had a huge number of other experiences throughout your life. It's in the past, or if it's still going on, like a medical condition, It doesn't have to define who you are. We have Buddha nature. We're not defined by the worst things that have happened to us. We're not defined by the best things that have happened to us. We're not defined by the worst things people call us or the best things that people call us. We have Buddha nature. And so it's a matter of acknowledging it, but letting it go. Don't let it define you.